Chapter 13. My belly is pinched and aches. It scares me to be so hungry. I know you're half starved, I told the foal, rubbing her tiny muzzle. She tilted her head back to take two of my fingers in her mouth, sucking hard. She thinks you're her mother, Bevan said from behind me. Here, and Herb said to give you these. She handed everyone spare clothes. I met her eyes. Thank you, Bevan. Thank you for me too. Thank them for me too. She held out the short-bladed iron knife we used to cut bark to hold the butter pats we made. I brought this too, to start the tears and to cut the ends. I wish could just do it for you, but Fallen. I know, I said. This is more help than I expected. I'm grateful. She leaned close to kiss the foal's forehead, then mine. We haven't milked the heifer, and we won't, she said. Then she was gone. I settled the foal into a nest of spare clothes, keeping aside my outgrown lean and my mother's old yellow linen brat. I would cut up my own clothes for the halters first. Maybe I wouldn't need more. The braiding took me longer than I wanted. The foal's halter was easy enough. She was small and it didn't need to be stout. I made the one for the heifer thick and strong as I could. I used Bevan's old lean as well as my own and some of the yellow brat. I only had enough cloth for a short lead, but I wouldn't need a long one. The foal was asleep, her dark lashes resting on the gray silver of her coat. Stay here, I whispered. When I stood up, I stuck the knife high in a sapling oak so she wouldn't set on it if she woke. I stopped the heifer and took a deep breath, then started off, careful to walk silently until I was a good distance away. Cows are not trained to be led like horses. The heifer let me put the halter on after a few tries, but she didn't want anything to do with me. I pulled and cajoled and tugged, but she wouldn't follow. I kept glancing up the hill. Once Garak was there, she waved, then ran back to work. I hoped Fallen hadn't seen her idling. The last thing I needed was for Fallen to turn her perpetual anger on me, or worse yet, the foal. I finally picked a tempting handful of grass and held it out to the heifer. Glorious day! It worked. The cow took a few steps with me, backing up, keeping the tender grass just out of reach. Then she snatched it from me and chewed, planting her hoofs again. We repeated the process. It worked until I was almost to the top of the hill. Then she dropped her head to graze on a rich patch of grass, ignoring me completely. I tugged on the lead, and she jerked her head, irritated, pulling it out of my hands. I grabbed it back, and she sidled away from me, bawling softly. I looked at her udder. It was full. It looked stretched. It probably hurt. You aren't going to get milk today, I told her, but I know a filly who needs a mother as much as you need a calf. The cow stopped pulling and stared at me, her huge eyes and the deep red brown of peat bog water. I looked uphill and my heart skipped, then pounded. The fall wasn't in the clothes nest. I turned to tuck the lead rope into the halter so the cow wouldn't stop on it until I could get back to her. When I spun around to run uphill, I almost fell over the foal. She whickered and wobbled toward me, reaching for my hand. My pulse still pounding, holding my breath, I steadied the foal against my leg, then patted the cow's back and flank in a calm, careless way, like any milker does when she sets to work. The cow stood still. The foal took another clumsy step. The cow blinked, looking at the filly. She had been milked only 3 or 4 times and was just getting used to it. Out in the open like this, without a tie post or a spancel to hobble her, even a calm old cow would be hard to milk. This one was young, and she had no idea what to make of me or the horse child at her side. Stand still, I said firmly, guiding the filly forward. Her instincts would tell her to reach up to nurse, but the heifer was not nearly as tall as her natural mother. Sliding my hand along the cow's side, I reached for her udder, squeezing a few drops of milk onto my finger. The filly licked the milk eagerly, her tongue warm and soft. The cow lowered her head to graze, and I dropped the lead, concentrating on the filly. I drew her closer, gently pushing her head down with one hand, while I brought forth a little more milk with the other. Inch by inch the foal came closer, following my milky hand, finally taking the milk for herself. The heifer lifted her head and sighed, turning back to look at the foal. The easing of the ache in her udder was obvious on her face. She worked her tongue in and out, like a cow licking her calf. I stepped back so she could nuzzle the filly. She curled her lip at the strange scent, but she continued licking the filly's side as she nursed. She looked content. The filly's eager nursing was relieving the pressure in her udder just as hands did when they milked her. She went back to her grazing. I sat down in the grass, watching with tears in my eyes. This was the simple truth. If the filly could eat, she would live. After a time, the heifer walked forward. The foal lifted her head and followed, weaving to keep her balance, reaching down to nurse again when the cow stopped to eat. I heard a soft whistle and looked up to see Garak standing outside the byre, looking downhill at me. She threw her hands in the air and danced a silent circle and grinning. Then she ran back inside. I heard the happy voices and Garak hushing them as they lined up to watch. Then, before Fallen could look up from her sheep milking down the hill and notice, they ran back. When the foal was full and sleepy, I walked her back to her nest of outgrown clothes. Even though she had nursed from the cow, she seemed to think I was her mother in that regard, that she should stay close to me. She sank onto the cloth and closed her eyes. After a few minutes, she stretched outside and fell fast asleep. Giddy, silly, full of joy, I ran to help my friends. The next morning, Fallen watched the foal nurse, making little sounds of disbelief, then of disapproval. That foal is barely more than skin and bone. It won't live past a few days. It's a waste of good milk. I was the only one standing near, and I searched for some answer, but couldn't find one. She walked off without saying more. I watched her go. I will tell you true. I was coming near to plain disgust with her. Unless something made her angry, it held no interest for her at all. I knew my own father was much like her. I thanked the saints and the old gods that my mother was not. She was the one I wanted to be like. I wanted to be guided by what I loved, not what I hated. The foal straightened her neck and lifted her head. She was tall for a foal, and I leaned toward her, feeling her soft breath on my cheeks. I closed my eyes and knelt so she could explore my face, pushing her muzzle gently into each of my eyes, then the crook of my neck. She looked at my ear, then mouthed the bridge of my nose. I sat back laughing. She shook herself, nearly falling over, and wobbled back to the cow to nurse again. I left the halters on both of them, even though there seemed to be little use for either one. If nothing else, the white and yellow braid made the cow easy to spot in the herd. The foal slept with me every night, the way we had done her first night on the surf. I curled myself against the curve of her back, and she slept soundly, her front legs tucked into her chest, through the silent, starry nights. For her daytime milk stupor naps, she lay full out, flat against the ground in the shade. On the third day, I moved her nest of old clothes up to the back side of the byre, where I could hear her when she woke and nickered, calling to me. Every moment that she didn't need me, I worked. More than anything in the world, I wanted to keep her for my own. I wanted to train her to let me ride her, and I wanted the two of us to race through the woods together. That meant I had to prevent Fallen from telling my father I hadn't worked hard enough. The filly was hungry 5 or 6 times a day. It wasn't long before her flesh thickened, and she began to manage her long legs better. One morning, after she had her fill of milk, she raced me up the path. She won, of course. Bebin and Garak saw her clattering along, kicking up dust, and they laughed with me when I got to the top. The foal was shy with them, but that morning she let Bebin touch her neck before she galloped off, circling to come back to me. That morning she was the first time the filly didn't fall sound asleep after nursing. She followed me into that byre. I knew she couldn't stay. Since Fallen was out with her ewes, I set up my workbench in the shade of a tree beside the byre and pressed curds there. The fowl cantered in circles around the tree, leaping and playing for a time. Then she went back to her clothes pile and slept. The next day Fallen saw the filly playing, and I thought it might soften her heart. But it didn't. She watched, frowning. The first time anyone finds a leaf or a bit of sand grit in the cheese, I will explain to my brother exactly how it got there. I promised her I was being very careful, but she stalked away, and I was speaking. Her face flushed. When she was halfway down to her sheep again, she shouted my name. At first I was sure that she had thought of one more insult and was turning to hurl it at me, but she only pointed north. I ran to tell the others.